He was disgusted by his fat daughter. So he sold her to a billionaire CEO, thinking he'd finally gotten rid of his shame. But when the deal was done, and she walked through those mansion doors, something no one expected began to happen. She wasn't weak. She wasn't worthless. She was pure heart, kind, gentle, and full of faith. And the cold, handsome billionaire who bought her started to see her not as a burden, but as a blessing. Soon, the world would watch this quiet girl become a symbol of hope, and the man who bought her fall to his knees for her love. But just when happiness feels within reach, a secret from her past explodes, turning love into scandal and fame into fire. When the world mocks her again, will she break like before, or rise as the goddess everyone tried to destroy? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The evening sun cast long shadows through the modest living room window of the Jones family home in Cedar Grove, North Carolina. 23-year-old Mabel Jones stood before the streaked mirror in the hallway, her fingers nervously smoothing the wrinkles from her simple blue dress. The cotton fabric, though clean and pressed, had seen better days, but it was the nicest thing she owned. "Stop fidgeting!" Richard Jones barked from behind her, his calloused hands wrestling with his tie. "You look like a stuffed biscuit in that dress anyway!" Mabel's hands stilled, dropping to her sides as she tried to make herself smaller. Her father's words stung as they always did, but she forced a gentle smile. "Would you like help with your tie, Daddy?" Richard's reflection glared back at her. "I got it." He yanked at the fabric roughly. "Just don't embarrass me tonight. This Holt fella could bring jobs to town with his factory. Last thing I need is you messing it up." The doorbell chimed precisely at 7 o'clock, making Mabel jump. Her heart hammered against her ribs as her father strode to answer it. In walked Damien Holt, his presence immediately filling their small home with an aura of power and privilege. His grey cashmere sweater and perfectly tailored navy pants made their furnished rental house seem even shabbier. "Mr. Holt?" Richard's voice shifted to something almost jovial. "Welcome to our home." Damien's steel blue eyes swept the room with calculated precision before landing on Mabel. His face remained impassive, giving away nothing. "Thank you for having me," he said, his voice deep and controlled. Mabel hurried to the kitchen to serve dinner, her hands trembling as she carried out the dishes she'd spent all day preparing. The pot roast had turned out well, tender and fragrant with herbs from her small garden. She'd even managed to bake a fresh apple pie for dessert. As they sat around the worn oak table, Richard dominated the conversation with talk of business and local politics. Mabel kept her eyes down, focusing on her plate, until her father's voice turned sharp with familiar cruelty. "Girl's got her mama's cooking skills, at least," Richard said, gesturing toward Mabel with his fork. "Shame she got her appetite, too. Maybe she's worth something to someone richer than me, though." He laughed, the sound hollow and mean. The words hit Mabel like physical blows. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "You're beautiful inside and out, sweet girl. Don't let anyone tell you different." But her mother had been gone for 15 years now, leaving Mabel alone with Richard's constant criticism. Damien sat perfectly still, his expression unchanged as he observed the exchange. The lamplight caught the sharp angles of his face, throwing shadows that made him seem carved from stone. His fork moved with precise efficiency between his plate and mouth, each movement measured and controlled. "You know," Richard continued, his tone taking on an edge that made Mabel's stomach clench, "if you're looking for some extra incentive for that factory deal, you could take her off my hands." He gestured toward Mabel with his chin. "Might be worth something to have a decent cook around." The silence that followed was deafening. Mabel's cheeks burned with shame as she stared at her barely touched dinner. She waited for Mr. Holt to leave in disgust to end this horrible evening. Instead, Damien set down his fork with deliberate care. "Draw up a companion contract," he said, his voice as cool and detached as if he were discussing the weather. "We can sign it tonight." Richard's eyebrows shot up, but a calculating smile spread across his face. He pushed back from the table, hurrying to fetch paper and pen from his desk. Mabel sat frozen, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The contract took mere minutes to draft, a simple document trading Mabel's companionship for Richard's cooperation in the factory negotiations. Damien signed without hesitation, his pen scratching across the paper with swift efficiency. "Pack your things," Richard told Mabel after Damien left, not meeting her eyes. "You'll be leaving first thing tomorrow." Later, in her small bedroom, Mabel knelt beside her narrow bed. The ancient alarm clock on her nightstand ticked past midnight, marking each moment of her last night in the only home she'd ever known. Her hands clasped together as tears slipped down her cheeks. "God," she whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible. "If this is my road, walk it with me." The prayer was simple but heartfelt, carrying all her fear and uncertainty into the quiet night. Through her window, she could see the stars scattered across the North Carolina sky like diamonds on velvet. The same stars her mother used to say were God's nightlights, keeping watch over his children. Mabel drew strength from that memory as she began to pack her meager belongings into a worn suitcase, preparing for whatever tomorrow might bring. The contract lay on her bedside table, the ink still fresh enough to catch the moonlight. A simple document that had changed everything in the space of one evening. She touched it gently, wondering what kind of life awaited her in Damien Holt's world of wealth and power. But more than that, she wondered if she could bring light into what seemed like such a cold place. In the stillness of her room, surrounded by the fragments of her simple life, the cross-stitched Bible verse on the wall, the collection of dog-eared cookbooks, the faded quilt her mother had made, Mabel found a quiet resolve growing within her. Whatever came next, she would face it with the grace and faith her mother had taught her. Even if she had to walk this strange new path alone, she knew she wasn't truly alone at all. The morning sun cast long shadows across Mabel's driveway as Damien's sleek black Mercedes pulled up. Through the tinted windows, she could barely make out his silhouette in the driver's seat. Her father hadn't even come outside to say goodbye. Mabel's hands trembled as she clutched her worn duffel bag, the sum of her life packed into one small space. The leather seats felt cool and strange against her skin as she slid into the back, the new car smell so different from her father's old pickup truck. "Good morning," she whispered, but Damien only nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as they pulled away from the only home she'd ever known. The 2-hour drive to Charlotte passed in complete silence. Mabel watched through the window as familiar small-town scenes gave way to highways, then towering buildings that seemed to touch the clouds. Her heart beat faster with each mile that separated her from everything she knew. When they finally pulled up to Damien's mansion, Mabel's breath caught in her throat. The house was enormous, with pristine white columns and perfectly manicured gardens. Marble steps led up to massive double doors that gleamed with polished brass hardware. Inside, her modest flats clicked against marble tiles that stretched as far as she could see. Crystal chandeliers hung from soaring ceilings, and artwork that probably cost more than her father's house lined the walls. The grandeur made her feel smaller than ever. "Mrs. Lane will show you to your room," Damien said, his first words since picking her up. Without waiting for a response, he strode away, his footsteps echoing through the vast space. A woman in her 60s appeared, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her black dress was simple but elegant, and her eyes crinkled kindly at the corners as she smiled at Mabel. "Welcome, dear. I'm Mrs. Lane, the housekeeper," she said, her voice warm with a gentle southern lilt. "Let's get you settled." They climbed a sweeping staircase to the second floor, where Mrs. Lane opened a door to reveal a suite that was bigger than Mabel's entire house. A massive four-poster bed dominated the space, draped in silk the color of cream. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the gardens, and a sitting area held plush furniture that looked too perfect to actually use. "The bathroom's through there," Mrs. Lane said, gesturing to a door. "And that's your closet." Mabel's eyes widened as she saw the walk-in closet, already filled with designer clothes. Labels she'd only seen in magazines hung in neat rows. But as she touched a silk blouse, her heart sank. Everything looked sized for someone much smaller. Mrs. Lane noticed her expression and touched her arm gently. "You have kind eyes, dear," she said softly. "Don't let this place swallow them." The words brought unexpected tears to Mabel's eyes. She blinked them back quickly, managing a wobbly smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Lane," she whispered. Left alone, Mabel sat on the edge of the enormous bed, feeling lost in the vastness of the room. She unpacked her few belongings carefully, some modest dresses, her mother's old Bible, a small photo album, and her favorite cookbook. The afternoon stretched on, and Mabel remained in her room, not daring to venture out into the mansion's endless hallways. She changed into one of her own simple dresses, unable to bring herself to try on any of the beautiful but wrong-sized clothes in the closet. As the sun began to set, she settled on the thick carpet, her Bible open in her lap. The familiar words brought comfort in this strange new world. She was so absorbed in reading that she didn't hear Damien approach until he spoke from the doorway. "Why aren't you exploring the house?" Mabel looked up, meeting his cool gaze. "It's not mine to explore," she answered simply. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, but it was gone so quickly, she might have imagined it. He stood there for a moment longer, then turned and left without another word. After he'd gone, Mabel went to the kitchen. Mrs. Lane showed her where to find everything, and soon the warm smell of chocolate chip cookies filled the air. As they baked, Mabel found a small note card and carefully wrote, "Thank you for not yelling. I'll try to be good company." When the cookies were done, she arranged them carefully on a silver tray she found in one of the cupboards. The halls were silent as she made her way to Damien's office, following Mrs. Lane's earlier directions. Light showed under the closed door, but she didn't knock. Instead, she set the tray down quietly and slipped away. Later that night, Damien sat at his desk, Mabel's file open before him. Her medical records, education history, and background check were laid out like any other business acquisition. But his eyes kept drifting to the tray of cookies sitting untouched at the corner of his desk. He hadn't eaten any. He never ate sweets. But something stopped him from throwing them away. The simple note propped against the plate seemed to mock his carefully ordered world. In all his years of business deals, no one had ever thanked him for not yelling. The cookies sat there all night as he worked, filling the office with a homey scent that felt completely out of place among his leather-bound books and expensive electronics. When he finally left his office in the early hours of the morning, the cookies remained exactly where she'd left them, neither accepted nor rejected, much like Mabel herself. The mansion settled into its nighttime silence, but something had shifted in its atmosphere. In one of its many rooms, a girl knelt beside an enormous bed, praying for strength. In another, a man sat in his private quarters, unable to explain why he couldn't bring himself to dispose of a plate of homemade cookies. And somewhere between them, a housekeeper smiled knowingly as she turned out the lights, recognizing the first subtle stirrings of change in the grand house's cold halls. Morning light filtered through the elegant curtains as Mabel stirred from sleep. For a moment, she felt disoriented in the massive bedroom. so different from her modest room at home. The events of yesterday came rushing back, and she sat up slowly, smoothing the silken sheets. She dressed quickly in one of her simple dresses, then made her way to check on the cookie tray she'd left outside Damien's office. Her steps echoed in the quiet hallway. When she reached the tray, she paused, a small smile tugging at her lips. One cookie was missing from the perfectly arranged plate. Just one. But it was something. Mrs. Lane found her in the hallway and guided her to the breakfast room, where morning sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured gardens. The table was set for 2, though it could have seated 12 comfortably. Damien arrived precisely at 7:30, his charcoal suit immaculate, his tablet in hand. He barely glanced up as Mabel quietly thanked Mrs. Lane for the coffee she poured. "I see your small-town upbringing extends to your table manners," he commented, watching as she carefully arranged her napkin in her lap. His tone carried a hint of sarcasm. "How quaint." Mabel took a slow breath, maintaining her composure. "Yes, sir. My mother taught me well." "And does your mother know you're here?" His question held an edge. "My mother passed away when I was 12, sir." Mabel's voice remained steady, though her fingers tightened around her coffee cup. Something flickered in Damien's expression, so brief she almost missed it. The silence stretched between them until Mabel broke it softly. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me a place to breathe." His fork paused halfway to his mouth. When he spoke again, his tone had lost some of its sharp edge. "Eat your breakfast, Miss Jones." After breakfast, Mabel found herself drawn to the gardens. The morning air was crisp, and dew still clung to the perfectly trimmed grass. She walked slowly along the stone paths, taking in the carefully tended flower beds and architectural hedges. A movement caught her eye, a scraggly orange cat peering out from beneath a bush. Mabel knelt, carefully, extending her hand. "Hello there, sweet thing," she called softly. To her delight, the cat crept closer. She noticed its ribs showing through its fur and remembered the bacon she'd saved from breakfast. As she offered the treat, more cats emerged from the gardens, 5 in total. "You poor things," she murmured, dividing the bacon among them. "We'll have to find you something better tomorrow." "Morning, miss." A weathered man in work clothes touched his cap to her. His name tag read, Frank. "Good morning." Mabel's smile was genuine and warm. "These are beautiful gardens. You must work very hard." Frank's weather-beaten face creased in a surprised smile. "That we do, miss. 20 years I've tended these grounds." 20 years! You must know every flower by name." Mabel's laugh rang out, clear and musical. Inside the mansion, several heads turned at the unfamiliar sound. A maid paused in her dusting, and a kitchen worker smiled unconsciously. Even Mrs. Lane looked up from her work, a knowing expression crossing her face. Throughout the morning, Mabel met more of the ground staff. She learned their names, asked about their families, and shared genuine interest in their work. Her laughter became a recurring sound in the usually silent gardens. As evening approached, Mabel found Mrs. Lane in the formal living room, carefully gathering pieces of a broken crystal vase. "Oh, let me help," Mabel said immediately, kneeling beside the older woman. "Dear, you don't need to," Mrs. Lane began, but Mabel was already carefully collecting the scattered fragments. "My mother always said many hands make light work," Mabel replied, gently placing pieces on the cloth Mrs. Lane had spread out. "You're not paid to work." Both women looked up to find Damien standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Mabel met his gaze steadily. "I'm not paid to be ungrateful either, Mr. Holt. Mrs. Lane has been kind to me, and kindness deserves kindness in return." Something shifted in Damien's eyes, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed. He turned away sharply, leaving them to their task. Later that night, in his private office, Damien sat before multiple security monitors. His finger hovered over the trackpad, replaying footage from the gardens. On the screen, Mabel knelt among the flowers, surrounded by cats. The groundskeepers gathered around her, their usual stern expressions replaced by genuine smiles. He watched as Frank, who had barely spoken 10 words to him in 20 years, threw back his head in laughter at something Mabel said. The kitchen staff had started leaving bowls of cat food by the back door. The maids smiled more as they worked. Damien's jaw tightened as he watched this small woman somehow softening the edges of his carefully controlled world. She moved through his property like a warm breeze, stirring things that had long been still. He clicked through more footage. Mabel helping Mrs. Lane with the vase, Mabel thanking the kitchen, staff by name, Mabel singing softly to herself as she walked the gardens. Each image was another crack in the perfect order he'd built. The security footage played on as Damien sat in his leather chair, unable to explain the unsettling warmth that crept into his calculated world. Outside his window, a stray cat lounged on a garden wall, well-fed and content, while somewhere in the mansion, a plate of cookies sat with one piece missing, small changes appearing like hairline fractures in the foundation of his carefully constructed life. 3 days had passed since Mabel's arrival at the Holt mansion, and the morning light streamed through the enormous kitchen windows. The spacious kitchen, with its gleaming stainless steel appliances and marble countertops, had become her sanctuary. Today, she stood at the center island, flour dusting her hands as she worked dough for homemade biscuits. "My mama's recipe never fails," she explained to Mrs. Lane and 2 kitchen staff members who watched with interest. "The secret is cold butter and a light touch." The warm, buttery smell filled the kitchen as Mabel shaped each biscuit with practiced hands. Her simple cotton dress, chosen from the few items she'd brought from home, already bore traces of flour, but she didn't mind. "These are for all of you," she said, smiling at the small gathering of staff. "You've made me feel so welcome here." Outside in the hallway, Damien Holt paused mid-stride. The sound filtering from the kitchen was foreign to his ears. Genuine laughter, warm and unrestrained. He found himself drawn closer, staying just out of sight. "Oh, goodness!" Mabel's voice rang out, followed by more laughter. She'd accidentally knocked over the flour container, sending a white cloud across her dress. Instead of getting upset, she giggled at her own clumsiness. "Well, I guess I'm wearing my baking now." The kitchen staff joined in her laughter, the sound echoing off the pristine walls. Damien felt something shift inside him, a crack in his carefully maintained facade. The joy in that kitchen was real, unscripted, unpretentious. It reminded him of before spreadsheets and board meetings, before his mother's death had turned him to steel and strategy. Later that evening, Damien found himself walking past Mabel's room. The door was partially open and soft words drifted out into the hallway. She was praying, kneeling beside her bed like a child. "And Lord, please bless Mr. Holt." Her gentle voice carried clearly to where he stood frozen. "He's lonely, but good underneath. I can see it, even if he tries to hide it. Help him remember that he's more than his success." Damien stepped back, his chest tight with an unfamiliar emotion. When was the last time anyone had prayed for him? Had seen past his carefully constructed walls? Her words stirred something long buried, remorse for what he'd become, fascination with her uncomplicated goodness. The next morning, he made a decision. He found Mabel in the garden, already surrounded by her usual audience of stray cats. "Miss Jones," he said, his voice more gruff than he intended. "We are going into the city today. You need proper clothes." Mabel looked up, surprised. "Oh, I don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble. Be ready in an hour." The drive into Charlotte was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Mabel watched the city approach through the car window, her eyes wide at the gleaming buildings. Damien found himself watching her reactions in the rearview mirror more often than necessary. The exclusive boutique he chose was all glass and chrome, with prices that would make most people faint. As they entered, Damien noticed the subtle looks from the sales staff, the raised eyebrows at Mabel's size, the whispered comments behind manicured hands. Mabel noticed too, but she didn't shrink away. Instead, she smiled warmly at each person she passed, thanking them when they offered assistance. Her genuine kindness seemed to confuse them more than her appearance. As they browsed the racks, a commotion near the register caught their attention. A young salesgirl was being berated by her manager, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," the girl sobbed. "The register system crashed and I—" "Excuses won't fix this mess," the manager snapped. Before Damien could process what was happening, Mabel had crossed the store. She placed a gentle hand on the crying girl's shoulder. "Take a deep breath, honey," she said softly. "Everything feels worse when we can't breathe properly." She demonstrated, taking an exaggerated breath. The salesgirl hiccuped, but followed Mabel's lead. Together they took several deep breaths until the girl's sobs subsided. "There now," Mabel smiled. "Sometimes technology has a mind of its own, doesn't it? But you're smart, and you'll figure it out. Want to try again with a clear head?" The girl nodded, wiping her eyes. While Mabel kept her calm, the manager's anger seemed to deflate in the face of such gentle intervention. Within minutes, they'd identified the problem and fixed the system. Damien watched the entire scene unfold, transfixed. In her simple dress, surrounded by luxury she couldn't afford, Mabel glowed with an inner beauty that had nothing to do with appearance. Her gentleness was a force all its own, transforming the cold boutique into something warmer, more human. The rest of the shopping trip passed in a blur of measurements and selections. Mabel accepted only the most modest options, despite Damien's insistence that cost wasn't an issue. By the time they left, the salesgirl had hugged Mabel twice, and even the manager smiled genuinely as they departed. The drive back to the mansion was quiet, but different from their journey into the city. This silence felt reverent, filled with unspoken revelations. Damien's hands were tight on the steering wheel as he processed what he'd witnessed. Here was someone who faced cruelty with kindness, who saw the person behind the tears, who turned shame into grace. When they pulled up to the mansion, Mabel turned to him with simple sincerity. "Thank you, Mr. Holt. Not just for the clothes, but for being willing to take me yourself. It was kind of you." Damien opened his mouth, but no words came. How could he explain that she'd given him more than he'd given her? That her simple thanks felt more valuable than any business deal he'd ever closed? He watched her walk into the house, her steps light despite the weight of shopping bags, and realized he had no words to match the purity of her gratitude. The invitation arrived on heavy cream cardstock, gold letters gleaming under the mansion's soft lights. Damien's annual charity gala, a night when Charlotte's elite gathered to display their wealth under the guise of generosity. Mabel traced the embossed letters with trembling fingers as Mrs. Lane helped her into the blue evening gown they'd chosen. 2 weeks, Mabel whispered, smoothing the silk fabric. 2 weeks since I came here and now this. Mrs. Lane pinned another curl into place, her weathered hands gentle. You shine from within, dear. Remember that tonight. The gown was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk that flowed like water, carefully tailored to embrace Mabel's curves rather than hide them. But as she descended the mansion's grand staircase, each step felt heavy with doubt. Damien waited at the bottom, his tuxedo immaculate, his expression unreadable. When she reached him, he paused, something flickering in his eyes. "You look," he started, then stopped. The car's waiting. The drive to the Grand Charlotte Hotel was tense with unspoken words. Mabel watched the city lights blur past, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mr. Holt," she said softly, "what should I tell people? About us?" "The media's already calling you my fiancé," he replied, his voice clipped. "Let them think what they want." The hotel entrance blazed with camera flashes, a gauntlet of reporters and photographers crowding the red carpet. Mabel's heart thundered as their driver opened the door. Damien emerged first, then extended his hand to help her out. The moment she appeared, the whispers began. "Is that her? She's huge. What was he thinking? Must be a publicity stunt. He's pitying her, obviously." Each whisper felt like a knife, but Mabel forced herself to stand tall, channeling her mother's words. "Grace isn't about how you look, sweetheart. It's about how you love." They made their way down the carpet, Damien's hand firm against her back. Reporters shouted questions, camera flashes nearly blinding them. Then one voice cut through the chaos, sharp with mockery. "Mr. Holt, was there a shortage of actual models in Charlotte? Or is this some kind of charitable gesture?" The journalist, a sleek woman in a red dress, smirked as she held out her microphone. The crowd tittered, and Mabel felt her cheeks burn. But before she could step back, Damien's hand found hers, his fingers interlaced with hers, grip tight and sure. The movement was so unexpected that the cameras started flashing even more frantically. "That's my fiancé you're mocking." Damien's voice cut through the noise like steel. His usual cold control had an edge of fury. "Mock her again, and you mock me. I suggest you consider what that means for your future access to any of my events." The crowd froze. The journalist's smile died. In the sudden silence, Mabel could hear her own heartbeat. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back, squeezing Damien's hand in silent gratitude. Inside, the ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and flowing champagne. The elite of Charlotte circled them cautiously now, their earlier mockery replaced with careful politeness. Mabel smiled and nodded, answered questions about their engagement with gentle deflection, and tried not to notice how many people stared at their still joined hands. As the evening wore on, she found moments of genuine connection, complimenting an elderly woman's brooch, helping a waiter clean up a spilled drink, sharing her umbrella with a guest who'd forgotten hers when rain started falling on the terrace. Small kindnesses that felt like anchors in a sea of artifice. Later, needing air, they ended up on a quiet balcony overlooking the city. Charlotte sparkled below them, a galaxy of earthbound stars. Mabel's feet ached from her heels, but her heart ached more from the night's emotional toll. "You didn't have to defend me," she whispered, looking out at the lights. "I'm used to." "Maybe I did." Damien cut her off. His voice was rough, almost angry. "Maybe I'm tired of watching people mistake cruelty for cleverness." Across town, in a modest living room, Richard Jones stared at his television screen. The clip of Damien defending Mabel had gone viral, playing on every local news channel. His daughter, his useless daughter, was being called a symbol of grace under fire. The glass in his hand shook with suppressed emotion. But in his office at the hotel, Damien faced a different kind of storm. 3 members of his board had cornered him, their faces grave. "This has gone too far," Marcus Chen, his lead investor, said. "The markets are nervous. Your stock dropped 5 points after that scene outside." "End this engagement charade," Sarah Hamilton added. "Or watch investor confidence crumble. We can spin it as a mutual decision, but it needs to end." Damien stood at his office window, looking out at the balcony where Mabel sat. She was humming softly, some hymn he didn't recognize, her face tilted up to catch the breeze. The blue silk of her dress rippled like water in the night air. his empire or his heart. The choice shouldn't have been difficult. He'd spent his whole life choosing power over emotion. But watching Mabel's simple grace touch person after person tonight, seeing genuine warmth replace cold calculation. The humming drifted through the window, gentle as a prayer. Damien's hands clenched at his sides as his board waited for his answer, and for the first time in his adult life, the path forward wasn't clear. Morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Damien's office, but the atmosphere inside was anything but bright. Papers scattered across his normally pristine desk as Jessica Torres, his PR manager, paced frantically in her designer heels. "This is a nightmare," Jessica declared, waving her tablet. "Social media is exploding. Half the people are calling it a fairy tale romance. The other half think it's a publicity stunt gone wrong. The business press is having a field day speculating about your mental state." Damien sat at his desk, his silver pen tapping against the polished wood. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He hadn't slept much after the board's ultimatum. "And the stock?" he asked, voice clipped. "Down another 3 points this morning." Jessica's red lipstick twisted into a frown. "We need to issue a statement. Something to calm the markets." Through the window, movement caught Damien's eye. In the garden below, Mabel knelt beside Mrs. Lane, her hands dirty with soil as they planted rows of white daisies. She wore a simple sundress, her hair tied back with a ribbon, looking completely at peace despite the storm brewing around her. "Mr. Holt," Jessica prompted. "The statement?" "Later," he said, standing abruptly. "I need to speak with Miss Jones." The garden air was sweet with spring when he stepped outside. Mrs. Lane noticed him first, rising with a knowing look in her eyes. "I'll fetch some water for these new blooms," she said, tactfully retreating. Mabel looked up, dirt smudged on her cheek. "Good morning," she said softly. "The daisies needed a new home. Mrs. Lane says they're survivors. They'll grow anywhere if you give them a chance." Damien's prepared speech about the board's concerns suddenly felt hollow. He loosened his tie, looking at the neat rows of flowers. "The board disapproves," he said finally. "Of us. Of this arrangement." "I know." Mabel's smile held a gentle sadness. "I heard them last night. They want me to end it. Say it was all a misunderstanding." Mabel stood slowly, brushing soil from her dress. "And what do you want?" "I want—" He stopped, frustrated. "It's not that simple. There are shareholders, contracts, millions of dollars at stake." "If loving people costs you power," she said quietly, "maybe it's not power you need." The words hit him like a physical force. He stared at her, this woman who spoke truth so simply it stripped away all his careful defenses. "I should go clean up," she said when he didn't respond. "These daisies will need time to find their roots." He watched her walk away, her words echoing in his mind. Throughout the day, through endless meetings and crisis calls, they wouldn't leave him alone. At 4 o'clock, he made a decision. He called his assistant. "Cancel the merger meeting with Tokyo." "Sir, that's a $3 billion deal. Cancel it and make a reservation for 2 at Laurent's, 7 o'clock. The restaurant was intimate, tucked away from prying eyes. Mabel arrived wearing one of her new dresses, simple navy blue that brought out the warmth in her eyes. When she saw the private table, candlelit and secluded, her hands twisted nervously in her lap. "I thought," she started. "I assumed you'd want to discuss the board's concerns." "No business tonight," Damien said firmly. "Tell me about your mother." Surprise flickered across her face, then a soft smile. "She loved music," Mabel said. "She taught our church choir. Even when she was sick, she'd sing. Said it made the pain less somehow." "What did she sing?" Hymns, mostly, but also these old folk songs her grandmother taught her. Mabel's eyes grew distant with memory. She used to say that singing was like baking. You put love in, and it comes out multiplied. You bake, Damien observed. I do. She laughed softly. I always dreamed of opening a bakery someday. Not just any bakery. A place for girls who've been bullied or hurt. Somewhere they could learn to create beautiful things. To see their own worth. The candlelight caught the hope in her eyes, and something shifted in Damien's chest. What would you call it? Sweet Grace, she said without hesitation, because that's what saved me. Grace. When my father... She stopped, then continued more quietly. When things were hard, I'd bake. It reminded me that broken things can become beautiful. Tell me more, he found himself saying, and for the next 2 hours, they talked. Really talked. She told him about singing in the choir, about the elderly neighbors she baked for, about the stray cats she'd named in his garden. And somehow, surprisingly, he found himself talking too. He told her about his childhood drawings, hidden away in a box he never opened, about his mother's garden, now covered by the east wing of his mansion, about the last time he really laughed, 8 years ago, before business consumed his life. Then Mabel told a story about accidentally using salt instead of sugar in her first cake, and somehow he was laughing again. Really laughing, deep and genuine, until his sides hurt. The next morning, he called a press conference. Cameras flashed as he stepped up to the podium, Mabel beside him. There has been speculation about my engagement to Mabel Jones, he began, his voice firm. Let me be clear. This engagement is real. Any further questioning of its legitimacy will be met with legal action. In the back of the room, his board members stood stone-faced, but Damien didn't look at them. He looked at Mabel, who watched him with those gentle eyes that saw straight through to his soul. Later, as they walked through the mansion's halls, a whispered conversation between 2 staff members drifted around the corner. Did you see him at the press conference? The way he looked at her? I know. He must actually love her. Mabel's steps faltered. Her heart pounded against her ribs as the words sank in. But years of her father's cruel dismissals rose up like shadows, whispering that it couldn't be real. That someone like Damien Holt could never truly love someone like her. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beat beneath her palm. The daisy garden beckoned through a nearby window, white petals turning gold in the afternoon sun. Survivors, Mrs. Lane had called them. Growing anywhere, they were given a chance. The days melted into each other like watercolors on canvas, each one bringing subtle changes to the mansion's atmosphere. Where silence once ruled, music now floated through the halls, starting in the kitchen where Mabel spent her mornings. My mama taught me this one, Mabel said to Rosa, the cook, one sunny Tuesday morning. Her hands were deep in bread dough as she began to sing, her voice clear and sweet. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Rosa's eyes lit up, and soon her rich alto joined in harmony. The kitchen staff paused their work, drawn in by the simple beauty of the old hymn. Even Mrs. Lane appeared in the doorway, smiling as she listened. Unknown to them, Damien stood just outside, briefcase in hand, frozen by the sound. Something about the melody reached past his careful defenses, touching a place he'd long kept locked away. When the song ended, he found himself walking into the kitchen instead of heading to his office. Good morning, he said, surprising everyone. Is there coffee? Mabel's flour-dusted hands stilled. Of course. Would you like to join us for breakfast? That first shared breakfast became many. Day by day, Damien's rigid schedule softened to include morning meals at the kitchen table, where Mabel's fresh-baked bread and gentle conversation worked their own kind of magic. His shoulders relaxed, his responses grew longer, and sometimes, just sometimes, he'd catch himself smiling. Their evening walks began accidentally. Mabel was admiring the sunset from the garden when Damien returned from work. Instead of heading inside, he found himself joining her. "The daisies are doing well," he commented, noting how the evening light caught the gold in her hair. "They're fighters," she replied. "Like your mother's roses must have been." He stiffened. "How did you know about those?" "Her portrait," Mabel said softly. "In the foyer. She's holding a yellow rose." The portrait had hung there for years, a cold reminder of loss. But Mabel saw it differently. That evening, as they walked past the roses that still grew wild at the garden's edge, she stopped. "May I pray for her?" she asked quietly. Damien's throat tightened, but he nodded. "Dear Lord," Mabel began, her voice gentle as the evening breeze, "thank you for Margaret Holt, for the beauty she brought to this place, for the sun she raised. Help her roses keep blooming, and help those who miss her feel your peace." A weight Damien hadn't known he carried seemed to lift slightly from his shoulders. Their walks became a daily ritual, quiet conversations under deepening skies. Sometimes they talked about simple things, the weather, the garden, the day's events. Sometimes they walked in comfortable silence, but something was changing, like spring thawing winter's grip. One morning, exploring the mansion's quieter corners, Mabel discovered a door that stuck slightly when opened. Inside, dust motes danced in streams of sunlight that fell across dozens of canvases. Some hung on walls, others leaned in stacks against each other, all signed with a younger Damien's bold stroke. Landscapes blazed with color, mountains wrapped in storm clouds, forests dappled with sunlight, oceans caught in moment of fury or peace. But what caught her breath were the portraits, faces caught in laughter, in thought, in quiet dignity. Each one alive with emotion and story. "You weren't supposed to find this." She turned to find Damien in the doorway, his face unreadable. "These are beautiful," she said simply. "Why did you stop?" He moved into the room slowly, as if the paintings might bite. "I forgot how to see color," he admitted, echoing her question from weeks ago. "After Mother died, everything seemed gray." Mabel touched a canvas gently, a scene of sunrise over mountains. "Then let's start small," she suggested. "Paint me the sunrise tomorrow." He started to refuse, but something in her eyes, that unwavering belief in possibility, made him pause. "I haven't touched a brush in years." "The sunrise doesn't mind," she smiled. "It's new every morning." The next day, she found him on the east terrace before dawn, an easel set up, his hands remembering old movements as he mixed colors. The sky bloomed pink and gold, and his brush moved with growing confidence. When it was done, he studied it with surprise. It wasn't perfect. The colors weren't quite right, the composition was slightly off. But something of the morning's magic had made it to the canvas, and he was smiling. "Thank you," he said awkwardly, not quite meeting her eyes. "You're welcome, Mr. Holt," she whispered, her heart full of a feeling she didn't dare name. That night, though, old ghosts visited her dreams. Her father's face, twisted with contempt, loomed in her mind. "You'll ruin everything you touch," he sneered, his voice as cruel as she remembered. "Just like you ruined our family." She woke with tears on her cheeks, the early morning light just beginning to creep through her windows. In the distance, she could hear Damien setting up his easel for another sunrise, and her heart ached with equal measures of hope and fear. The house had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Music drifted through once silent halls, and laughter no longer seemed out of place. The staff moved with lighter steps, and even the gardens seemed to bloom more vibrantly. But it was Damien himself who had changed the most, his edges softening, his smile appearing more frequently, his eyes holding something that looked remarkably like peace. Yet Mabel's father's words echoed in her mind, a shadow threatening the light that had begun to grow. She pressed her hands against her window, watching Damien prepare his paints in the distance, and whispered a prayer that had become as familiar as breathing. Lord, help me believe in the good you see in me, even when I can't see it myself. The sunrise that morning painted the sky in shades of hope, and somewhere in the kitchen, Rosa had already begun to sing. The morning sun painted Charlotte's streets in gentle autumn hues as Damien's car glided through the city's quieter neighborhoods. Mabel sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the scenery change from manicured lawns to more modest surroundings. The Women's Hope Shelter stood like a beacon of promise, a 3-story brick building with white trim and window boxes full of resilient marigolds. "Are you sure about this?" Damien asked, his fingers tapping the steering wheel. He looked different today, dressed in a simple blue sweater instead of his usual business attire. Mabel nodded, her eyes bright with purpose. These women need to know they're not alone, that someone sees them. The shelter's director, Sarah Martinez, greeted them at the door. Her weathered face broke into a warm smile when she saw Mabel. "The ladies are so excited to meet you. They've read about you in the papers." Mabel's cheeks flushed. "I'm just here to listen and share, if they'll let me." Inside, the shelter's common room held about 20 women of various ages. Some sat with perfect posture, others hunched as if to make themselves invisible. All eyes turned to Mabel and Damien as they entered. "Hi, everyone," Mabel said softly, taking a seat in the circle. "I'm Mabel, and I'd love to hear your stories, if you're willing to share them." One by one, the women began to speak. Stories of abuse, of rejection, of being told they weren't enough. Mabel listened with her whole heart, offering gentle words of encouragement and understanding. When a young mother broke down describing how her husband had mocked her weight in front of their children, Mabel moved to sit beside her. "My father," Mabel began, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes, "used to call me his greatest disappointment. He'd say I was worthless, that no one would ever want me. The night I met Damien, my father tried to trade me, like I was property." The room fell silent. Even Damien, standing at the back of the room, felt his chest tighten. "But every night," Mabel continued, "I would pray, not for my situation to change, but for strength to see myself through God's eyes, to remember that I was fearfully and wonderfully made, even when the world said otherwise." An older woman with silver hair spoke up. "How did you find the courage to believe that?" Mabel smiled gently. "One day at a time. One prayer at a time. And sometimes God sends people into our lives who help us see the truth about ourselves." Her eyes met Damien's briefly, and something unspoken passed between them. The morning stretched into afternoon as stories continued to flow. Mabel shared her mother's recipes, promised to teach them her special biscuits. She hugged those who needed hugging, held hands with those who trembled, and prayed with those who asked. Damien watched it all, something profound shifting in his heart. This wasn't the calculated kindness of charity galas. This was raw, real connection, the kind that changed lives. When Sarah took him aside to discuss the shelter's needs, he wrote a check for $1 million without hesitation. "This should help with the renovations and new programs you mentioned." But Mabel, overhearing, touched his arm gently. "Your presence means more than your check, Damien. Stay. Listen. Let them know that good men exist." So he did. He sat in that circle, listening to stories that made his hands clench in anger and his heart ache with compassion. He watched Mabel demonstrate simple breathing exercises she used when anxiety struck, saw her share her well-worn Bible with a young woman who'd lost everything. As they were leaving, Sarah pulled Damien aside. "Your fiancé," she said, her eyes misting, "has changed every woman in there today. Not just with her words, but with her presence. They saw someone who'd walked through fire and emerged with her kindness intact." The drive home was quiet, but it wasn't the tense silence of their early days together. Damien kept glancing at Mabel, who was looking out the window with a peaceful expression. He realized with startling clarity that he was falling in love with her, not with any dramatic revelation, but with the quiet certainty of sunrise. As they pulled into the mansion's circular drive, the sky opened up. Rain poured down in sheets, catching them both by surprise. In a moment of spontaneity that surprised even himself, Damien grabbed Mabel's hand and pulled her toward the shelter of the porch. They stood there, breathless and slightly damp, under the warm glow of the porch light. Without overthinking it, Damien leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. It was a gesture of reverence more than passion, an acknowledgement of the sacred space she'd created in his life. "Thank you," Mabel whispered, her eyes shining. "For what?" "For seeing me." Those 3 simple words carried the weight of years of invisibility, of being overlooked and undervalued. Damien's throat tightened with emotion he couldn't quite express. Later that night, long after the house had gone quiet, Damien sat in his study with a sketchbook. His hands moved across the paper with growing confidence, capturing the gentle curve of Mabel's smile, the kindness in her eyes, the quiet strength in her bearing. He worked until dawn, trying to capture not just her features, but the light that seemed to shine from within her. The sketch wasn't perfect. No art ever could be. But it caught something essential about her. The way she looked when she was truly seen, truly valued. The way she looked at the shelter, surrounded by women who recognized in her their own potential for healing and hope. Outside his window, another day was beginning. Somewhere in the kitchen, he could hear Mabel's voice joining Rosa's in morning hymns. The sound wrapped around his heart like a promise, and he realized that his carefully ordered world would never be the same. And for the first time in his adult life, that thought didn't frighten him at all. The grand ballroom of the Charlotte Convention Center sparkled under crystal chandeliers. 300 of the city's most influential people gathered for the annual Children's Hope Foundation banquet. The air hummed with anticipation as Mabel Jones, wearing a flowing emerald gown that made her eyes shine, stepped up to the podium. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. Damien watched from his seat at the head table, his heart swelling with pride. The past weeks had changed them both in ways neither could have imagined. "Good evening," Mabel began, her voice soft but clear. "Most of you know me as Damien Holt's fiancé, but tonight I want to tell you my real story." The room fell silent. Cameras flashed. Mabel took a deep breath and continued. 2 months ago, I was a small-town girl living in fear of her father's judgment. He saw me as worthless because I didn't fit his idea of perfect. One night, he invited a wealthy businessman to dinner, not to share a meal, but to offer his daughter as a business transaction. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Damien's jaw tightened at the memory. "My father sold me that night," Mabel said, her voice breaking slightly. But what he didn't know was that God had a bigger plan. You see, when my father tried to trade me for business favors, God was orchestrating my rescue. He sent me someone who saw past my size, past my insecurities, past everything the world said was wrong with me. Tears glistened in her eyes, but her voice grew stronger. My father sold me, but God bought me back with love. Through Damien's kindness, through the warmth of this community, through every person who showed me I had value, God restored what was broken. The audience sat spellbound. Several women dabbed at their eyes with napkins. Even the seasoned photographers lowered their cameras, caught up in her words. So tonight, as we raise money for children who need hope, remember this. Sometimes the biggest miracles come disguised as our deepest wounds. Sometimes our greatest pain becomes our greatest purpose. As Mabel finished speaking, the room erupted in applause, but before she could step away from the podium, Damien was moving. Something in her words had broken the last wall around his heart. He strode toward the stage, his steps purposeful. The audience whispered and pointed as he climbed the steps. Mabel turned to him, confusion in her eyes. Without hesitation, Damien dropped to one knee before her. The gasps and exclamations from the crowd faded into background noise. All he could see was Mabel's face, her eyes wide with surprise and emotion. "Mabel Jones," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent room. "You came into my life as a business arrangement, but you've become my heart's greatest treasure. You've taught me that true worth isn't measured in dollars or deals, but in the capacity to love and be loved." He pulled out a ring, not the flashy engagement ring they'd used for show, but a simpler, more meaningful one. A delicate gold band with a pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "Your father tried to sell your worth, but you're priceless beyond measure. Will you marry me? Not for show, not for business, but because I love you with everything I am?" Tears streamed down Mabel's face as she nodded, unable to speak. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as Damien slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms. Camera flashes exploded around them, capturing the moment for tomorrow's headlines. But in that moment, they were in their own world, holding each other as years of pain melted away in the warmth of true love. Social media exploded within minutes. America's unlikely fairy tale started trending. Videos of the proposal went viral, with millions sharing and commenting on the beautiful transformation of their story. Hours later, they sat together on their favorite balcony at home. The night was clear, stars twinkling above them like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Mabel's head rested on Damien's shoulder, their fingers intertwined. "It feels different now," Mabel said softly, looking at her new ring in the starlight. "Like everything that happened before was leading to this moment." Damien squeezed her hand gently. "You've changed me, Mabel. I used to think power meant control. Success meant profit. You showed me what really matters." She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Maybe God sent you to heal what my father broke," she whispered. Damien touched her cheek tenderly. "Maybe you were sent to heal me." They sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the peace of the evening and the warmth of their love. Neither noticed the dark figure watching from the shadows of the garden below. Richard Jones, his face twisted with bitterness as he watched his daughter's happiness. His hands clenched into fists as he observed their tender moment, envy and vengeance burning in his heart. But up on the balcony, Mabel and Damien remained lost in their own world, their hearts finally whole, their love a testimony to the healing power of grace. The stars continued to shine above them, witnesses to a love story that had transformed from a business transaction into something beautiful and real. Damien looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how natural it felt now. The woman beside him had walked into his life as a business arrangement and somehow become his miracle. As they drifted into peaceful contentment, the night wrapped around them like a protective blanket, holding their moments of healing close. Above them, a shooting star streaked across the sky, A brief, brilliant reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things come from unexpected places. Their story had become more than just a viral sensation or a social media trend. It had become a testament to the transformative power of love and faith. The warmth of their connection filled the space between them, creating a bubble of peace that seemed to push back against the darkness. In that moment, their hearts beat in perfect synchronization, a rhythm of healing and hope that echoed across the quiet night. The morning sun crept through the mansion windows, but its warmth couldn't reach the chill spreading through Damien's chest as he stared at his phone. Headlines screamed across every major news outlet. Billionaire's bride, bought and paid for. Shocking documents reveal truth behind America's fairy tale. The price of love. Damien Holt's $500,000 bride. His hands trembled as he scrolled through article after article. Photographs of the contract, the one he'd signed that first night at Richard Jones's house, plastered across every screen. The careful wording that had seemed like protection, then now read like a transaction receipt. Mrs. Lane burst into his office, her usually composed face tight with worry. "Sir, they're everywhere. The phones won't stop ringing." Damien's email inbox flooded with notifications, major sponsors pulling out, stock prices plummeting. His PR team's frantic messages blurred together on the screen. In the kitchen, Mabel stood frozen, watching the morning news. Her father's face filled the screen, his expression smug as he spoke to reporters. "It was all a business deal," Richard Jones said, waving the contract. "He bought her like any other asset, paid good money too." He smiled, patting his new designer suit pocket. Mabel's legs gave out and she sank into a chair. The cook reached for her hand, but Mabel barely felt it. Social media notifications pinged on her phone. Cruel comments, harsh judgments, mocking memes spreading like wildfire. "Gold digger! How much did Daddy sell you for? Guess everything has a price tag." Upstairs, Damien's voice boomed through the halls as he argued with his board on speakerphone. "This is ridiculous. You can't expect me to—" "The numbers don't lie, Damien," a board member cut in. "We've lost 3 major partnerships in the last hour. Our stock is in free fall." "She needs to disappear," another voice added. "No more public appearances. No more photos. Hide her away until this blows over." Mabel crept up the stairs, her heart breaking with each step. She paused outside Damien's office door, hearing the desperation in his voice. "You're asking me to give up the only good thing I've ever had." His words echoed through the hallway. "She's not some PR problem to be solved. She's the woman I love." Tears streamed down Mabel's face as she backed away from the door. She fled to her room, her vision blurred by tears. The beautiful space that had become her sanctuary now felt like a gilded cage. She pulled out a piece of paper, her hands shaking as she wrote, "My dearest Damien, you gave me worth when I thought I had none. You showed me love when I only knew shame. Now it's my turn to love you enough to let go. Your empire was built on trust and respect. I won't let my presence destroy that. You deserve a love that doesn't cost you everything. You gave me wings. Now I'm using them to set you free. All my love, Mabel." She placed her engagement ring, the beautiful pearl surrounded by diamonds, on top of the note. Outside, storm clouds gathered, as if heaven itself mourned with her. Mabel slipped out through the servants' entrance, carrying only her small duffel bag, the same one she'd arrived with. The rain started falling as she walked down the long driveway, each step feeling like lead. An hour later, Damien finally emerged from his office, exhausted from fighting for their love. "Mabel!" he called out, his voice echoing through the empty halls. Mrs. Lane appeared, her face grave, holding out the note and ring. "She's gone, sir." Damien read the words, his hands trembling. Thunder crashed outside as rain pounded against the windows. the same kind of storm that had led to their first real moment of connection. His knees gave out, and he collapsed in the marble foyer. The note crumpled in his fist as he pressed his forehead to the cold floor. The mansion's silence pressed in around him, colder and more oppressive than ever before. "Mabel," he whispered, his voice breaking. The sound of rain seemed to mock him, reminding him of the night he'd kissed her forehead under the porch light, the night he'd first allowed himself to feel something real. Mrs. Lane stood quietly nearby, tears in her eyes as she watched the man who had everything lose the one thing that mattered most. The storm raged outside, matching the turmoil in Damien's heart. The mansion that had finally begun to feel like a home now echoed with emptiness, its warmth leaving with the woman who had brought light into its shadows. On the kitchen counter, abandoned and forgotten, sat a half-finished batch of cookies, the last trace of Mabel's presence in a house that had never deserved her gentle spirit. The security cameras captured her final moments on the property. A small figure walking away in the rain, head bowed but shoulders straight, carrying the dignity that no contract could ever purchase and no scandal could ever take away. Rain continued to fall as darkness settled over the mansion, leaving Damien alone with the consequences of a love that began as a transaction but had become everything, and the crushing weight of losing it all to the very world he'd once thought he controlled. The mansion's grandeur had turned hollow. Where warmth once filled its spaces, silence now reigned. 3 days had passed since Mabel's departure, and the change in both the house and its owner was palpable. Damien Holt sat in his darkened office, tie loosened, suit jacket discarded hours ago. The wall of security monitors cast an eerie blue glow across his unshaven face. His finger hovered over the replay button, a motion he'd repeated countless times over the past 72 hours. The footage played again, Mabel in the garden, her head thrown back in laughter as she shared a joke with the groundskeeper. Her joy, even through the grainy security feed, lit up the screen. The timestamp showed it was from just last week, a lifetime ago. "Sir?" Mrs. Lane's gentle voice broke through his trance. She stood in the doorway, concern etched on her weathered face. "You haven't eaten since yesterday morning." Damien didn't turn from the screens. "I'm not hungry." "The board called again. They're expecting you at the merger meeting in 30 minutes. Cancel it." His voice was flat, emotionless. "Cancel everything." Mrs. Lane stepped into the office, her practical shoes making soft sounds on the hardwood floor. "Starving yourself won't bring her back, Mr. Holt." The security footage continued to play. Mabel in the kitchen, flour on her cheek, teaching the cook how to make her mother's biscuit recipe. Her voice had filled these halls with song that day. "She made everything better," Damien whispered, more to himself than to Mrs. Lane. "How did she make everything better?" Mrs. Lane placed something on his desk, a well-worn Bible with a soft leather cover. "She left this behind. Found it on her nightstand this morning." Damien finally turned from the screens. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the book. It fell open naturally to a marked page, and his eyes caught the highlighted verse. "The Lord is near to the broken-hearted and saves the crushed in spirit." Something inside him cracked. The careful walls he'd built, the emotional distance he'd maintained even through their growing closeness, it all came crashing down. A sob tore from his throat, raw and unexpected. "I can't," he choked out, pressing his palms against his eyes. "I can't do this without her." Mrs. Lane laid a motherly hand on his shoulder. "Then don't." He looked up at her, eyes red-rimmed and questioning. "Don't do this without her," Mrs. Lane continued. "Go find her." Damien stood so quickly his chair rolled back and hit the wall. "Where would I even start?" "Where she began," Mrs. Lane said simply. "Her hometown." Within minutes, Damien was in his car, the Bible carefully placed on the passenger seat where Mabel had once sat. The rain that had started the night she left hadn't stopped, as if heaven itself mourned her absence. The highways stretched before him, slick with rain. He drove through the night, past gleaming city lights into smaller towns where street lamps grew fewer and farther between. His GPS guided him to the modest community where he'd first met her, where her father had tried to sell her like property. Dawn was breaking as he pulled into the town's main street. The local diner was just opening, steam rising from its vents into the misty morning air. Inside, the waitress recognized him immediately. His face had been splashed across every tabloid in the country. "Mabel?" the waitress said when he asked. "She was here 2 days ago, helped old Mrs. Peterson with her grocery shopping, then moved on." The local shelter told a similar story. "Such a sweet girl," the director said. "Spent a day helping us organize our donation room. Said she needed to keep moving, keep helping where she could." Each stop brought the same message. Mabel had been there, had helped someone, had touched lives, and then had moved on. She was leaving a trail not of breadcrumbs, but of kindness. The church secretary wiped away tears as she spoke of Mabel. "She played piano for our Wednesday service. The congregation hadn't sung that joyfully in years. But when we offered her a permanent position," she shook her head. "Said she couldn't stay, that she had more hearts to touch." Damien sat in his car, rain drumming on the roof, and opened her Bible again. More highlighted verses caught his eye. "Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." Even in her pain, even when the world had turned against her, Mabel was still giving, still loving, still bringing light to dark places, just as she had done in his mansion, in his life. The rain continued to fall as he drove through neighboring towns, following whispers of her presence. A soup kitchen where she'd served meals, a nursing home where she'd read to residents, a women's shelter where she'd shared her story of finding worth beyond others' judgments. She was here, people kept saying. But she moved on to help someone else. In each place, he saw the impact of her spirit, the smiles she'd left behind, the hope she'd planted. She was doing exactly what she'd always done, turning pain into purpose, rejection into love. As night fell again, Damien pulled into a small-town gas station. His crisp suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it in frustration. The teenage attendant looked at him curiously. "That girl you're looking for," the boy said. "The one from the news? She bought gas here yesterday. Told me I reminded her of her little brother she used to have. Spent an hour just listening to me talk about school and stuff." He paused. "Nobody ever just listens like that, you know?" Damien knew. It was exactly what had drawn him to her, her ability to make everyone feel seen, heard, valued, the very thing his wealth and power had never been able to buy. Back in his car, he held her Bible close. The rain had finally stopped, but the ache in his heart remained. She was out there somewhere, turning her wounds into healing for others, just as she had done for him. "I will find you," he whispered into the quiet car, "and this time, I'll be worthy of your love." The security footage on his phone, the last captures of her laughter in his home, remained unwatched now. He didn't need recordings anymore. He needed her, real and present, bringing life back to his empty halls. As stars began to appear in the clearing sky, Damien started his car again. Somewhere ahead, Mabel was sharing her light with another soul in need, and he would search every dark corner until he found her again. The old white church stood like a sentinel against the darkening sky, its weathered steeple reaching toward heavy clouds. Damien's expensive car looked out of place in the gravel parking lot, where pickup trucks and modest sedans gathered for evening service. This was the church Mabel had mentioned during one of their quiet conversations, the place where she'd first learned to sing, where her mother had taught Sunday school before passing away. His footsteps echoed on the wooden steps as he approached the entrance. Through stained glass windows, warm light spilled onto the worn welcome mat. The sound of voices raised in song drifted through the doors, a hymn he recognized from Mabel's quiet humming in the garden. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The familiar words caught in his throat. How many times had he heard her sing this while tending to his roses? The memory of her voice, clear and pure, mixing with the morning dew, made his chest tighten. Inside, the sanctuary smelled of old wood and lemon polish. Evening light filtered through colored glass, painting rainbow patterns on well-worn pews. A small choir practiced at the front, their harmonies filling the space with gentle reverence. Along the walls, bulletin boards displayed the life of the church community. Damien's attention caught on one particular display, a memorial board covered in photographs. There in the center was Mabel's familiar smile. The pictures showed her through the years, as a little girl in a Sunday dress, as a teenager leading children's choir, as a young woman serving at the food pantry. In one photo, she stood surrounded by a group of women, all smiling, all looking at her with unmistakable affection. The caption read, "Our angel at the food pantry, sharing God's love one meal at a time." "She touched so many lives here," a voice said behind him. Damien turned to find an older man in a simple black shirt and clerical collar. Pastor Grant Thompson's kind eyes held no judgment, only understanding. "You're the man she prayed for," the pastor continued, stepping closer to study the photos. "Every Wednesday night, right there in the third pew, she'd come early, before anyone else, and pray for you." The words hit Damien like a physical blow. "She prayed for me? Even after?" "Even after," Pastor Grant confirmed. "She never stopped believing in the goodness she saw in you. Said God wasn't finished with your story yet." Damien's carefully maintained composure cracked. Here, in this simple church, surrounded by evidence of Mabel's lifelong faith and kindness, the walls he'd built around his heart began to crumble. "I didn't deserve her prayers," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't protect her when the media attacked. I let her walk away because I thought it would be better for her." Pastor Grant studied him thoughtfully. "Better for her? Or safer for you?" The question struck home. Damien sank onto a nearby pew, his head in his hands. "I've spent my whole life building walls, protecting myself from pain. Then she came along with her kindness, her faith, her absolute genuine heart. She saw right through every defense I had." "That's what love does," Pastor Grant said gently. "Real love, God's kind of love, it doesn't stop at our walls. It finds the cracks and seeps in until we're changed from the inside out." Tears fell freely now, dropping onto Damien's expensive suit. He didn't care. In this sacred space, where Mabel had grown and served and prayed, pretense felt meaningless. "I need to find her," he said. "Not to fix my company's image or to silence the press. I need to find her because without her, nothing else matters anymore." Pastor Grant reached into his pocket and withdrew a small slip of paper. "She called last week, asking for prayers for her new project. She's opened a small shelter for women in need, giving them a safe place to heal, just like you once gave her." He handed Damien the paper with an address written in neat handwriting. "It's about 2 hours north of here, in a little town called Hope Valley. She's doing good work there, helping others find their worth." Damien stared at the address, his vision blurring. She never stopped loving, did she? Even when the world was cruel, She just found new ways to give love. That's who she is. Pastor Grant smiled. She takes the pain others give her and turns it into healing for someone else. Always has, since she was a little girl bringing cookies to shut-ins with her mother. The choir had finished practicing, their last notes fading into the peaceful quiet of the sanctuary. Through the windows, Damien noticed something remarkable. The storm clouds that had followed him for days were breaking apart. Sunlight streamed through, catching the stained glass and creating a rainbow of colors across the wooden floor. "Look at that," Pastor Grant said softly. "Sometimes God sends us signs in the simplest things. The light always breaks through eventually, son. Always." Damien carefully folded the paper with Mabel's address and tucked it into his pocket, right next to her Bible. Standing, he looked once more at the photos on the wall, at the legacy of love one humble heart had created in this place. "Thank you," he said to Pastor Grant, "for showing me this, for helping me understand." "Don't thank me," the pastor replied. "Thank the one who brought you here. And when you find her, because I believe you will, remember that love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing every day to be better than we were yesterday." The sunlight grew stronger as Damien walked back to his car, casting long shadows across the churchyard. For the first time in weeks, he felt something new stirring in his heart. Not just hope, but purpose. He knew now what he had to do, where he had to go. The address in his pocket felt like a compass pointing true north, leading him not just to Mabel, but to the man he needed to become. As he started his car, the last rays of sunset painted the old white church in shades of gold, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled away into silence. The modest community center buzzed with activity as volunteers arranged folding chairs and hung inspirational banners for the shelter's first charity event. Simple paper flowers decorated the walls, handmade by the women who had found refuge here over the past weeks. A hand-painted sign read, "Hope Valley Women's Shelter, where worth is found." Mabel stood backstage, smoothing her floral dress, one she'd made herself, embracing her curves instead of hiding them. Her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed her notes, but her eyes shone with quiet confidence. This shelter had become her purpose, her way of turning past pain into present healing. Mrs. Thompson, one of the shelter's residents, approached with a warm hug. "We're ready when you are, honey. Full house out there." "I never thought we'd fill all those seats," Mabel admitted, peeking through the curtain at the gathered crowd. Local business owners, community leaders, and women from nearby towns filled the rows. "When we opened 6 weeks ago, I wondered if anyone would come at all. People recognize real love when they see it," Mrs. Thompson said, adjusting Mabel's collar with motherly care. "You've given so many of us our dignity back." The shelter had started small, just 3 rooms in an old Victorian house. But word spread quickly about the young woman who offered not just shelter, but understanding, who shared her own story of shame transformed into strength, who taught baking classes that became therapy sessions where women learned to create beauty from broken pieces. Sarah, a teenage girl who'd arrived at the shelter 2 weeks ago, hurried over with excitement. "Miss Mabel, the local news is here. They want to do a story about us." Mabel's heart skipped. Publicity meant more eyes on their work, but it also meant possible exposure to the world she'd left behind. To him. She pushed the thought away and focused on Sarah's bright face. "Then we'll give them a story worth telling, won't we?" The piano began playing softly as Mabel took her place behind the podium. The lights felt warm on her face as she gazed out at the assembled crowd. These people had become her new family, her community of healing. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Thank you all for coming tonight. Some of you might know me as the girl from the headlines. the one who was bought by a billionaire. Murmurs rippled through the audience. But that's not my real story. My real story is about finding worth when the world says you have none. As she spoke, sharing her journey from shame to purpose, she noticed movement at the back of the room, a late arrival slipping in through the doors. She continued, determined to stay focused. Every woman who comes through our doors carries similar wounds, words that cut, rejection that scarred, love withheld because we didn't fit someone else's mold. But here, we're learning together that our worth isn't in our size or our past. It's in our capacity to love, to heal, to rise again. The figure at the back moved closer, and Mabel's heart stopped. That grey sweater, those navy pants, the exact outfit he'd worn the night everything changed. Damien stood there, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the rest of the room fade away. Her voice faltered for a moment, tears welling up unbidden, but she forced herself to continue, even as her hands gripped the podium tighter. We've helped 27 women find housing in the past month. 15 have started job training programs, 10 are back in school, but numbers don't tell the real story, transformation does. Damien moved slowly through the crowd, never breaking eye contact. He looked different somehow, softer around the edges, the hard lines of his face gentled by something that looked like hope. Our mission here is simple. Mabel's voice quivered. We help women discover what God knew all along, that they are precious, purposeful, and worthy of love. Tears spilled onto her cheeks as Damien reached the front row. The audience watched in stunned silence as he walked up the 3 small steps to the stage. His presence, once intimidating, now felt like shelter. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the moisture in his own eyes. "The world called you fat," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I call you my reason to live." The words hung in the air for a heartbeat before the audience erupted into applause and cheers. Mabel's legs gave way as weeks of longing and loss overwhelmed her. She collapsed forward into his waiting arms, sobbing against his chest. "You found me," she whispered, breathing in his familiar scent. His arms tightened around her, one hand cradling the back of her head. "I never stopped looking," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. The applause continued around them, punctuated by sniffles and happy exclamations from the shelter residents who had come to love Mabel like family. Mrs. Thompson wiped tears from her eyes while Sarah bounced excitedly, clutching her friend's arm. Cameras flashed as the news crew captured the moment, but neither Mabel nor Damien noticed. They remained locked in their embrace, his grey sweater growing damp with her tears, her floral dress crushed against his chest. In that moment, they were just 2 hearts finding their way home. The piano player, caught up in the emotion, began playing softly. The same hymn Mabel had taught the cook in Damien's mansion all those weeks ago. Some of the shelter residents began to sing, their voices lifting in celebration of love that transcends judgment, of worth that defies measurement, of hearts that find their way back to each other against all odds. In their embrace, surrounded by the community Mabel had built from her own healing, they stood as living proof that love doesn't require perfection, only persistence, faith, and the courage to be seen for who you truly are. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching Mabel's tears and turning them to diamonds. In Damien's arms, she wasn't the girl who had been sold or mocked or deemed unworthy. She was simply herself, exactly as she was meant to be. And in her arms, Damien wasn't the cold billionaire or the calculated businessman. He was just a man who had finally learned that true worth can't be measured in dollars or degrees. Their story had come full circle, from a dinner of shame to a celebration of redemption. The grey sweater and navy pants that had once witnessed her humiliation now witnessed her triumph. And in that moment, Surrounded by applause and tears and joy, they both knew this was only the beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered bricks of the women's shelter. Inside, Richard Jones sat alone in his small apartment, mechanically spooning cold cereal while the local news played on his ancient television set. His hands trembled slightly as he watched his daughter's face appear on screen. Local hero Mabel Jones continues to make waves with her revolutionary approach to women's rehabilitation, the anchor announced cheerfully. The shelter, which opened just 2 months ago, has already helped over 50 women rebuild their lives. The camera panned to show Mabel leading a cooking class, her smile radiant as she demonstrated how to knead bread dough. She looked different somehow, not thinner or more beautiful by society's standards, but glowing with an inner light that made Richard's chest ache. With support from business titan Damien Holt, the shelter has expanded its services to include job training, counseling, and even a small bakery where residents learn valuable skills, the reporter continued. Richard set down his spoon, watching as his daughter hugged a thin woman who was crying with joy. The woman looked exactly like the type of person he used to mock, broken, lost, worthless, just like he'd made Mabel feel for all those years. "I was wrong," he whispered to his empty kitchen. "Dear God, I was so wrong." The segment showed Damien standing beside Mabel, his hand resting protectively on her lower back as she cut a ribbon for their new bakery expansion. The camera zoomed in on their faces, both of them radiating a happiness that seemed almost holy in its simplicity. Richard switched off the TV, his breakfast forgotten. He stared at his reflection in the dark screen, a man aged beyond his 45 years, lines of bitterness etched deep around his mouth. The same mouth that had spat so many cruel words at his only child. An hour later, he found himself parking his rusty pickup truck outside the shelter. The building wasn't fancy, just a renovated old warehouse with fresh paint and new windows. But there was something warm about it, something that spoke of hope and second chances. Richard sat in his truck for nearly 30 minutes, watching women come and go. Some carried children, others balanced books or bakery boxes. All of them walked with their heads held high, as if they'd found something precious here. Their dignity, perhaps. Finally, he forced himself to step out. His work boots scuffed against the pavement as he approached the entrance. Before he could reach for the door, it swung open, and there she was. Mabel stepped outside, probably heading to the bakery next door. She froze mid-step, her eyes widening as she recognized him. The folder she was carrying slipped from her fingers, papers scattering in the morning breeze. Richard's legs gave out. He fell to his knees on the concrete, not caring about the pain that shot through his aging joints. "I sold you, baby," he choked out, tears burning his eyes. "I was wrong, so wrong." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Mabel moved, quick and sure, crossing the space between them. Her hands, warm and strong, gripped his arms, helping him to his feet. "I forgave you long ago," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tears shining in her eyes. "God had a plan bigger than both of us." Richard looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the burden he'd convinced himself she was, but a woman of extraordinary grace. She'd taken his cruelty and turned it into compassion. His rejection had become her strength to accept others. Unknown to both of them, Damien stood in the shadow of the bakery doorway, watching the scene unfold. Tears slid silently down his cheeks as he witnessed the power of forgiveness transform two broken hearts before his eyes. "I don't deserve this," Richard mumbled, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. "None of us deserve grace," Mabel replied, pulling him into a hug. "That's what makes it beautiful." For the first time in 23 years, since the day his wife died giving birth to Mabel, Richard Jones held his daughter properly. Not with resentment or obligation, but with love and profound regret. He breathed in the scent of her hair, vanilla and cinnamon from the bakery, and remembered how his wife had smelled the same way. "Your mama would be so proud of you," he whispered. Mabel's arms tightened around him. "She'd be proud of you too, Daddy, for finding your way back." They stood there for a long moment, healing years of hurt in the morning sunshine. Finally, Richard pulled back, wiping his eyes with a weathered hand. "I want to help," he said gruffly. "I'm good with tools. This old building must need some work." Mabel's face lit up with hope. "We do need help," she said. "There's a group of fathers who volunteer here, men who lost their families to pride or anger, but who found their way back through service." "Like me," Richard said quietly. "Like you," she agreed. Damien chose that moment to step forward, his presence causing Richard to stiffen slightly. But the billionaire's face held no judgment, only understanding. "We could use a skilled mechanic," Damien said, extending his hand. "The shelter's van needs work, and we're starting a car repair training program for the residents." Richard looked at the offered hand, manicured, expensive watch glinting on the wrist, and remembered how he'd once tried to sell his daughter to this man. But Damien's eyes held no reminder of that shame, only a steady invitation to redemption. He took the hand, shaking it firmly. "I'd like that." Over the next few weeks, Richard became a familiar sight at the shelter. He fixed leaky faucets and creaky doors, taught women basic car maintenance, and worked alongside other fathers who carried similar burdens of regret. They formed an unofficial support group, sharing stories over coffee and tools, learning together how to rebuild not just buildings, but relationships. The women at the shelter, who had every reason to distrust men like him, gradually warmed to his quiet presence. They recognized in him the same journey they were on, learning to forgive themselves while making amends for past mistakes. One afternoon, as Richard repaired a broken window frame, he overheard two residents talking about Mabel. "She never gives up on anyone," one woman said. "Says everyone deserves a chance to change." "Even her own father," the other agreed. "After what he did." Richard's hands stilled on the window frame. He waited for judgment, for condemnation. "That's what makes her special," the first woman concluded. "She knows hurt people, but she believes healed people can heal people too." The words settled into Richard's heart like a balm. He thought about the man he'd been just months ago, bitter, angry, drowning in self-loathing he projected onto his daughter. Then he thought about the man he was becoming, one repaired relationship at a time. Later that day, as the sun set behind the shelter, Richard found Mabel in the bakery kitchen. She was teaching a young woman how to frost cupcakes, her patient voice carrying the same gentle tone her mother had used so many years ago. He watched from the doorway, remembering all the times he'd mocked her size, her dreams, her very existence. Now he saw her true weight, measured not in pounds but in lives, touched, hope restored, love freely given. "You can join us, Daddy," Mabel called out, not turning around. "There's always room for one more at this table." Richard stepped into the warm kitchen, accepting the frosting bag she handed him. As he clumsily attempted to decorate a cupcake, making a mess but earning encouraging smiles, he understood finally what his daughter had known all along, that love doesn't demand perfection, only presence. And in that moment, surrounded by the sweet scent of baking and the sound of gentle laughter, Richard Jones found himself truly home. The autumn sun cast golden rays across the newly renovated community center as guests gathered for the grand opening of The God Within Her Foundation. Elegant banners in soft blues and silvers draped the entrance, where Damien's latest masterpiece commanded attention. a stunning portrait of Mabel caught in a moment of pure joy, her face illuminated by sunlight and inner radiance. Inside, the space hummed with energy. Women from all walks of life mingled freely, their laughter and animated conversations filling the air. Some wore designer dresses, others wore modest hand-me-downs, but all carried themselves with the same dignity that Mabel had taught them to embrace. Mrs. Lane, now the Foundation's house mother, directed volunteers with gentle efficiency. Richard Jones, wearing a crisp new suit, proudly gave tours of the vocational training facilities he'd helped build. The transformation in him was as remarkable as the building itself. His eyes now carried warmth instead of judgment. At the center of it all stood Mabel, wearing a flowing blue dress that matched the summer sky. She moved through the crowd with natural grace, stopping to hug familiar faces and welcome newcomers. Her presence drew people in like a warm hearth on a cold night. Damien watched her from across the room, his heart full. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of planning, renovating, and healing. He'd returned to painting with renewed passion, spending early mornings capturing the way light played across Mabel's face as she prayed or worked or simply existed. The portrait at the entrance was his favorite. It showed not just her physical beauty, but the divine spark she carried within. The testimonies began as afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows. One by one, women stepped up to share their stories of transformation. A former executive spoke about finding purpose beyond perfection. A young mother described learning to love herself despite divorce. Each story echoed with the same theme: shame transformed into strength through love and acceptance. Music filled the spaces between speeches, hymns and modern worship songs performed by a choir that included several shelter residents. The melodies carried the message that had become the Foundation's cornerstone. Every soul carries divine worth. As evening approached, Mabel took the podium for the closing speech. The room fell silent, hanging on her every word. "A year ago," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I stood in my childhood home, believing I was worthless. My father's shame became my identity. But God—" She paused, smiling through tears. God had other plans. He took what was meant for humiliation and turned it into holiness. The crowd murmured in agreement, many wiping their eyes. "If I could tell that scared girl from a year ago one thing," Mabel continued, "it would be this: you were never unlovable. Your size, your circumstances, your struggles, none of these define your worth. You are a masterpiece created by the greatest artist of all." As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Damien moved to stand beside her. He took her hand, his voice thick with emotion as he whispered, "You were never bought, Mabel. You were a gift I didn't deserve." The audience rose to their feet, applauding as sunset light streamed through the windows, catching the subtle shimmer in Mabel's blue dress. The fabric seemed to dance with light, a physical representation of how shame had been transformed into grace. In that perfect moment, Mabel closed her eyes and whispered her final prayer. "He sold me in disgust, but God sold the world a glimpse of his goddess. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart."